When trust is shattered by the very hand that once offered friendship, what remains of a man's faith? This is the story of Elias, a man who faced the unimaginable and emerged not unscarred, but unbroken. Elias had never expected that the sharpest wound of his life would come from the very hands he once trusted most. The dawn had just begun to stretch its pale fingers over the hills of Judea when he set out that morning, his heart heavy with an unease he could not yet name. The olive trees around him stood silent, their silver leaves barely stirring in the faint breeze. He clutched his cloak tighter, as if shielding himself from the cold would somehow prepare him for what was about to unfold. For years, Elias had walked alongside Micah, his closest friend, almost like a brother. They had fished the same waters, broken the same bread, prayed under the same sky. Elias had shared with Micah his deepest fears and his most fragile hopes, never suspecting that hidden behind Micah's familiar smile was something dark and festering. That morning, however, there was no smile waiting for him at the village gate, only a note, crudely folded and wedged between the stones. The message was simple, almost careless in its tone. "Come to the eastern grove before the sun sets. We must speak." The handwriting was unmistakably Micah's, yet something about its brevity unsettled Elias. For a moment, he wondered if it was a jest or a petty quarrel. But deep within, a gnawing instinct urged him forward. As he tucked the note inside his tunic, he glanced once more at the horizon, where the sky bled into soft hues of orange and gold. The hours dragged by with a suffocating weight. Elias busied himself with his usual tasks, mending nets and tending to the goats, but his mind remained trapped by the summons. He kept asking himself what could be so urgent, so secretive, that Micah would not simply speak with him in the open as they always did. His hands moved through the familiar motions, yet every knot he tied felt like a binding around his own chest, tightening with each passing moment. When the sun finally dipped low, casting long shadows over the landscape, Elias made his way to the eastern grove. The air was thick with the scent of wild thyme and earth, and the last calls of the evening birds echoed through the valley. He paused at the edge of the grove, searching for Micah's silhouette among the twisted branches. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of his own breathing and the distant rustle of leaves. Then he saw him, Micah standing near the old sycamore tree where they had often met as boys. His posture was rigid, his arms crossed tightly against his chest as if to keep something in. Elias approached cautiously, noting the way Micah avoided his eyes, staring instead at the ground as though it might reveal some escape. The familiar warmth between them was gone, replaced by an icy stillness that made the hair on the back of Elias's neck rise. Before Elias could even greet him, Micah spoke, his voice brittle and low. "They know about your gatherings." Elias froze, his mind racing to make sense of the accusation. He had led quiet meetings for months now, small groups studying the scriptures, praying, encouraging each other to hold fast to the hope of the coming Messiah. These gatherings had been discreet but deeply meaningful, giving courage to many in their oppressed village. "What are you talking about?" Elias asked, his voice steadier than he felt. But Micah still refused to meet his gaze. Instead, he pulled something from beneath his cloak, a small pouch filled with silver coins that clinked together like a serpent's hiss. The sight of it struck Elias with a force he could not describe, as the sickening truth began to unfold right before his eyes. "I told them where you meet," Micah whispered, his words barely audible over the evening wind. Elias staggered back, his chest constricting, as though the very air had turned against him. "Why?" he managed to say, though the word felt meaningless in the face of what had just been revealed. Micah remained silent, his jaw tense, his eyes still fixed on the ground. The pouch of silver swung gently from his hand, a symbol of everything he had exchanged: loyalty for gain, friendship for betrayal. The weight of the moment crushed Elias's spirit, and for a long time, neither man moved. The sounds of the grove faded into a dull hum as Elias grappled with the realization that his closest friend had traded his trust for mere coins. Memories of their years together surged within him. The shared laughter, the nights spent discussing the promises of God, the dreams of a better world. All of it now tainted by this single, shattering act. Micah. Elias's voice broke as he spoke the name, but there was nothing more to say. The man before him had made his choice. The betrayal was complete. And yet, as the bitterness surged through him, Elias also felt a profound sorrow. Not just for himself, but for Micah, whose soul now bore the stain of treachery that no amount of silver could ever wash clean. Micah finally looked up, and for a fleeting moment, Elias saw the flicker of regret behind his hardened expression. But the moment passed quickly, and Micah turned away, walking slowly through the grove, leaving Elias standing alone beneath the sycamore. The fading light dappled the ground, casting long shadows that seemed to swallow the path ahead. Elias remained rooted in place, unable to move, his legs trembling beneath him. A part of him wanted to chase after Micah, to shake him, to demand an explanation that might somehow make this betrayal bearable. But another part knew that nothing could undo what had been done. Trust, once broken, could not be restored by mere words or apologies. The wound cut too deep. As night settled over the grove, Elias sank to his knees, his fingers digging into the earth as though trying to ground himself amid the whirlwind of pain. He prayed, not for revenge, nor for justice, but for strength. Strength to endure what would come next, for he knew that Micah's betrayal meant that the authorities would soon be coming for him, and for those who gathered with him in faith. Tears blurred his vision as he whispered the ancient words of the Psalms, the same ones he had recited since childhood. "Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me." The verses had always been a comfort, but now they carried a weight he had never fully understood until this moment, when even the closest of friends had turned against him. Hours passed, though Elias hardly noticed. The stars had emerged above the grove, their cold light indifferent to the anguish unfolding beneath them. Eventually, he rose to his feet, brushing the dirt from his knees, his mind heavy with both grief and clarity. He could not stay here. The grove, once a place of friendship and safety, was now a monument to betrayal. Elias made his way back to the village, his steps slow and burdened. He avoided the main paths, instinctively aware that eyes might be watching. Every sound in the darkness seemed amplified, the crack of a twig, the distant bark of a dog, as though the world itself had become hostile. Yet amid the fear, a quiet resolve began to take shape within him. When he finally reached his modest home, he found his wife, Miriam, waiting by the door, her face etched with concern. She didn't need to ask what had happened. The look in his eyes said everything. She embraced him tightly, holding him as the tears he had held back in the grove finally came, washing over him in silent waves of grief and disbelief. For the next few days, Elias lived in a state of watchful dread, knowing that the consequences of Micah's betrayal would soon reach him. He gathered his fellow believers quietly, warning them of the danger, urging them to be cautious, yet steadfast. Some wept openly, unable to comprehend that one of their own had been the source of their impending peril. The sense of betrayal extended beyond Elias. It fractured the very fabric of their community. Trust was now laced with suspicion, and fear crept into their prayers like a silent intruder. Yet even in this darkness, Elias stood before them, offering what hope he could. "We must not abandon what we know to be true," he told them, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. The days bled into each other, each one heavier than the last. Elias could feel the net tightening around them, though there were no soldiers at his door yet. Every knock, every unfamiliar voice in the market made his pulse quicken. Still, he refused to leave the village or abandon those who had looked to him for guidance. Fear might have chased others into hiding, but for Elias, the betrayal had ignited something stronger, a determination to remain faithful, even if it cost him everything. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting a crimson glow over the village, Elias stood at the edge of the sea, watching the gentle waves lap against the shore. The same sea where he and Micah had spent countless hours fishing together. The memories came unbidden, the way they used to race their boats at dawn, the laughter that echoed across the water. Now, all of it seemed to belong to another life, one that had been severed by a single, deliberate act. Miriam approached quietly, slipping her hand into his. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to remind Elias that he was not alone, that even in betrayal there remained love, steadfast and unyielding. He squeezed her hand gently, grateful for her silent strength. The sea breeze carried the faint scent of salt and wild herbs, mingling with the heavy anticipation that hung in the air. That night, as Elias lay beside Miriam in their small home, sleep evaded him. He stared at the rough-hewn beams above, listening to the distant sounds of the village settling into restless slumber. His mind was a relentless storm, torn between sorrow and resolve. He wondered what had driven Micah to such treachery. Was it fear? Greed? Disillusionment? The questions circled endlessly, but no answer could justify the pain. The answer came, not in words, but in the pounding of fists against their door just before dawn. Elias sat up immediately, his heart thundering in his chest. Miriam clutched his arm, her eyes wide with terror. Outside, muffled voices barked orders, and the sound of boots shuffled against the stone path. There was no time to run, no place to hide. Elias rose slowly, steadying himself with a breath of resolve. He opened the door to find several soldiers standing there, their torches casting flickering shadows across the narrow street. Behind them, cloaked in the dim light, stood Micah. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, yet he did not look away. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. Elias searched Micah's expression for any sign of remorse, but there was only the cold detachment of a man who had made his choice and would live, or die, with its consequences. The captain of the soldiers stepped forward. "Elias of Kadesh," he said sharply, "you are accused of inciting rebellion through illegal gatherings. You are to come with us." Miriam clung to Elias's arm, but he gently pried her fingers loose, placing a tender kiss on her forehead. He whispered, "Trust in the Lord," before turning to face his captors. His legs felt like stone as he stepped out into the street, the soldiers closing in around him. As they led him through the village, neighbors peeked through shutters and from behind doorways, their faces etched with fear and sorrow. Some wept quietly, others bowed their heads in silent prayer. Elias walked with his head high, refusing to let the betrayal define the last moments his people would see of him. He had spent years building their faith. He would not let fear be his final legacy. They brought him to a small outpost at the edge of the village, where rough-hewn walls and iron chains awaited. The soldiers shackled his wrists and shoved him into a dark cell. The heavy door slammed shut with a finality that reverberated through his bones. Alone in the cold, damp space, Elias sat against the wall, his eyes adjusting slowly to the dim light filtering through a small, barred window. The hours crawled by in oppressive silence, broken only by the distant sounds of village life continuing without him. He thought of Miriam, of the believers who now feared for their own safety, and of Micah, always of Micah. The face of his friend haunted him more than the chains around his wrists. It was not the betrayal itself that consumed him, but the loss of what they had once shared. Eventually, footsteps echoed down the corridor. The door creaked open, and Micah stepped inside, alone. For a moment, neither man spoke, the weight of all that had transpired filling the narrow space between them. Micah looked thinner, more worn than Elias remembered. His hand trembled as he reached out to place the pouch of silver on the floor between them, as if offering it back could somehow erase everything. "I didn't think they would arrest you," Micah said at last, his voice hoarse and brittle. Elias said nothing, his eyes fixed on the man he had once called brother. I thought they would just warn you." Micah's words crumbled into the stale air, as empty as the promise they carried. Elias closed his eyes briefly, gathering the strength to respond without hatred. "You thought wrong," Elias replied softly, his voice steady despite the ache within. Micah's shoulders sagged under the weight of the truth. He knelt down, his hands covering his face as if trying to hide from what he had become. Elias watched him, his heart torn between anger and compassion. Here was a man trapped by his own choices, broken long before the betrayal was ever carried out. Micah's muffled sobs filled the cell, a sound more harrowing than any accusation. Elias leaned forward, his chains clinking softly. "Why did you do it?" he asked, not in anger, but in earnest. Micah lifted his face, streaked with tears and dirt. "They promised me safety, money, a future. I was afraid, Elias." His voice cracked under the weight of his confession. "I didn't know what else to do." Elias closed his eyes again, this time to hold back his own tears. The man before him was not the enemy he had imagined in the sleepless nights since the betrayal, but a man consumed by fear and weakness, much like any other. When he opened his eyes, he spoke with a clarity that surprised even himself. "We all have fear, Micah, but fear is no excuse to betray what is right." Micah recoiled as though struck. For a long time, he said nothing, only stared at the pouch of silver that now seemed heavier than anything he had ever carried. Then, without another word, he stood up and left the cell, leaving Elias alone once more in the suffocating darkness. The door creaked shut behind him, sealing in the silence and all the unspoken things between them. The trial came swiftly. There were no formal proceedings, only the captain reading the charges and pronouncing the sentence, exile. Elias was to be cast out from the village, forbidden to return on penalty of death. Miriam was allowed to stay, but the community was warned against aiding him in any way. The punishment was as much about breaking his spirit as removing him physically. They led him to the outskirts of the village, past the familiar paths he had walked all his life. Miriam stood at a distance, tears streaming silently down her face. Elias wanted to run to her, to hold her one last time, but the soldiers kept him moving. As they crossed the boundary stone that marked the village's edge, one of the guards unshackled him and shoved him forward into the wilderness. The sun beat down mercilessly as Elias stumbled along the rocky path, his body weak from days of confinement, but his spirit unbroken. Every step away from the village felt like a tearing of flesh from bone. Yet he kept moving, clinging to the belief that his suffering was not without purpose. The scriptures had always spoken of trials, of faith refined by fire. Now he lived those words. Days turned into weeks as Elias wandered from village to village, often met with suspicion, sometimes with kindness. He found work where he could, mending nets, herding sheep, offering his skills quietly without drawing attention. But wherever he went, he carried the story of betrayal within him, a scar that neither time nor distance could erase. Yet, slowly, something unexpected began to grow in him, a deeper understanding of grace. The very act that had sought to destroy him had instead stripped away all illusions, leaving him with a faith more resilient, more compassionate. He met others along his journey who had also been betrayed, cast out, or broken, and he listened to their stories with a tenderness born from his own wounds. Years later, Elias settled in a small village by the sea, far from the place of his birth. He built a modest life, fishing once more, and occasionally teaching the scriptures to those who gathered in secret, just as he had done before. But this time, he spoke with a wisdom forged in the crucible of betrayal, offering not just knowledge, but hope to those who feared the cost of faith. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the water, he sat by the shore, watching the waves stretch endlessly toward the horizon. A young man approached him, asking why he bore such a distant look. Elias smiled gently, his eyes reflecting both the pain of the past and the peace he had found. "Because I know what it means to lose everything," he said quietly, "and to still find that God remains." The young man sat beside him, and for hours they spoke, not about doctrines or laws, but about endurance, forgiveness, and the courage to keep loving even after the deepest wounds. Elias shared his story without bitterness, only with the simple truth of one who had been broken and yet had survived. In the quiet of that evening, as the stars emerged one by one, Elias realized that the betrayal that once threatened to define him had instead become the very thing that deepened his capacity for compassion. The wound had not closed completely, nor would it ever fully, but it had healed enough to allow life to continue, and even to flourish. He thought often of Micah, wondering what had become of him. Sometimes he imagined him consumed by guilt, wandering as he once had. Other times, he hoped that Micah had found his own redemption, though he knew he might never know for certain. What mattered now was not Micah's fate, but how Elias had chosen to live in the aftermath. Years later, when Elias was an old man, a group of believers gathered around him one last time. They asked him to share words of wisdom before he passed. He looked at their eager faces and smiled softly. "Do not be afraid of betrayal," he told them, his voice steady. "It may break your heart, but it cannot break your soul if you let God hold it." Those who listened never forgot those words, nor the story of the man who had been betrayed by his closest friend, and yet had chosen forgiveness over hatred, resilience over despair. They carried his story with them as they spread across the land, forming new communities, facing their own trials, always remembering Elias's quiet strength. And when Elias finally closed his eyes for the last time, it was not with the bitterness of a man who had lost everything, but with the peace of one who had found what truly mattered. His life was not defined by the betrayal, but by the love and faith that had endured beyond it. The grove where the betrayal had taken place stood silent now, its branches older, its leaves whispering secrets to the wind. No one remembered the exact spot anymore, but in hearts across the land, Elias's story lived on, a testament to the power of faith over betrayal, of hope over despair, and of love that, even when wounded, never fully dies.